Thanks very much, Louise. I don't often get a good dinner like this when I come to places. I usually get sausages, often not completely cooked, but this is great. Just to give a bit of background, I started working with disasters because I was at the Children's Hospital in 1983, and I was asked to be part of a team that worked in the Macedon area after Ash Wednesday. And originally they said you can go up there, once a week for 6 months, that should do it. And we said at the end of 6 months, it's a long way for this community to go. So they said, all right, for a year. In the end, we kept going there for about 4 years. Halfway through that time, in 1985, there was the Central Victorian bushfires around Maryborough. And then at one stage, I was visiting these two communities that were 2 years apart in their recovery cycle. And then I started to see the patterns repeating from one community to another, and started to see that there are predictable things that happen in communities to the individuals and also in the whole community. And this really started me trying to understand what was happening. At that stage, nobody knew what was needed after disasters. What we learnt was that while there's a few people that do have, serious mental health problems, and they'll often be seriously impacted, for the vast majority, they actually continue to just keep functioning. And that's when you start to see some of the problems come out a year or two down the track. I remember working with a family that had a couple of boys, and they lost their house, and they asked me and my colleagues to meet with them and give them a bit of advice about their boys. I had a couple of boys who were, having various problems. 5 years later, the husband looks me up in the phone book, rings me up, and says, I'd like to come and see you. And he tells me who he is, and I remember him, and I think to myself, this will be interesting. I must make sure I see him. So I fitted him into my schedule, and he came out to see me. And he told me the story that he was looking after the boys. His wife had gone out with her friends that night. It was a Wednesday night. And he remembers looking out the front, seeing smoke in the distance, looking out the back. He could see smoke in the distance, looked out the front, and the front porch was on fire. And so he just threw the kids in a car and left. And he built this house himself out of mud bricks, and everything was burnt down. A few days later, he's out there sort of sifting through the ruins, and his mate comes over from his neighbour from nearby and says, well, I've lost my house too, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'm going to rebuild, what else can I do? So his mate says, well, I'll help you. So for the next 6 months, they just worked together. Every minute they weren't at their jobs, they were rebuilding. And he got the house to lock up in 6 months. Now you can imagine how exhausted he was. And he described how they all moved in. And once they had stuff everywhere, you imagine, and it's just lock up if there's no walls inside or anything. And then his neighbour comes over and says, fantastic to see you in. I'm going to start mine now. And he felt so guilty. He said, I've never felt anything like it, that sense of obligation to this person who gave me 6 months of his life. So I gave him 6 months. So 2 years later, they've divorced, sold everything, and he's living in a flat near the Essendon airport and seeing his kids every second weekend. And when he comes to me, he says, I don't understand what happened. I thought I had a good family. I thought I had a good relationship. And it's clear that what happened was he didn't understand that he needed to put energy and time and emotion into the most important things in his life, which was his marriage and his relationship with his kids and the family. And then build a house as he could. He fell for the trap of thinking, I've lost my house, I've got to rebuild my house. That's what I've got to do for my family. And I think this is, I've come to understand that this is what the stress response does to us. It focuses on the physical needs. And there are two basic responses. There's the initial response when the emergency is happening, and we go into this adrenaline mode. Now, what adrenaline does, you know, you have snakes up here, don't you? Remember the last time you nearly trod on a snake? You don't think, oh, that's a snake. What kind is it? Well, I don't know, you might do that up here, but you tread on them every day. But you just, I know that I encountered a snake suddenly without expecting it on my property, and I let out this animal howl and sort of just levitated into the air. Now, of course, I walk around with a stick and so on, but this was very unexpected. Now, that's what adrenaline does. It's a survival chemical. It just actually bypasses the brain, the part of us that thinks, and short circuits from your perception to the action. On another occasion, I was walking with my wife up Mount Riddell in the Yarra Valley to have a picnic. I don't advise it because there's a long bulldoze track going up. It's quite a long walk. And when you get to the top, there's too many trees, you can't see anything. And there's a whole lot of jagged rocks sticking up, so you can't even sit down anywhere. So we ended up standing on one leg, eating our sandwiches and pulling leeches off each other. But anyway, as we were coming down, I was pretty grumpy by this time. My wife's got the guidebook and she says, as we come to a rock face, is this the rock face that the guidebook said's got a crown formation? Can you see a crown formation? And I'm standing a little bit to one side, so I can't see no bloody crown formation. And she says, was that behind the tree there? Is that just over there? Now at that point, she's standing here, and I'm here, and about there I hear a scraping sound on the bulldoze track and look down, there's a tiger snake rearing up, wriggling vigorously towards her legs. Right? Exciting, isn't it? What do you reckon I did? You see, you've ever been in a situation where you actually don't make a decision to do anything, something happens. I'll tell you what I managed to do. And whacked her on the shoulder and she went, eek! And jumped back and the snake went into the bush. It was a perfect action, wasn't it? Perfect. And that's what adrenaline does. It just reacts out of the physical positioning of things and produces what's possible with the most primitive parts of our brain. And then we go on walking down and I think to myself, now this is part of the, you know, we're talking, it's not a big trauma, but it's a little trauma, you know. Part of the trauma is what you do with it afterwards. So I go walking down now thinking, what would have happened if it had bitten her? Have they got an ambulance in Healesville, or would it have to come all the way from Lilydale? Geez, that'd take a while. I'd have to look after her. What are you supposed to do? Oh yeah, I'd have to lie down and put her legs up against the tree. Now wait a second, that'd put the blood to her heart. No, I'd have to do that. Oh geez, I've forgotten all this stuff about snakebite, you know, and can you see I'm starting to elaborate the problem and giving myself a lot of anxiety. And I was observing this and thinking, this is interesting, isn't it? How now my brain is getting hold of this event and starting to generate a whole lot of things that didn't happen. This is one of the things that we can use a lot of energy worrying about what might have happened or what might happen next time or what didn't actually happen. And in the end, I remembered a reassuring piece of information that I think I'd read in it must have been the local Yarra Valley paper, which said no adult had died of snake bite in the last 20 years. The only problem is I've told this story in trainings I've done which have had paramedics present, and I remember one bloke sitting up the back shaking his head like this when I was telling this. No, it's not right. People die of snake bite regularly. But I'm very pleased I didn't know it at the time. So I think this is something to be aware of, that when you go into that initial experience of the flood, and hopefully you got a bit of warning, the less warning you get, the higher that adrenaline is. And you had a flood in '93, didn't you? You've had probably a few floods. So any element of experience of past floods, even though they're all different, aren't they? They behave differently, the water comes differently. From all my experience of dealing with many floods, I assume anywhere at all can flood if the rain falls in the right place. That's my motto. If you've got any experience at all, then that gives the adrenaline something to grab hold of, to give you an ability to do something that's kind of informed. It's got some purpose to it instead of just reacting. I don't know how it was with you and your floods, but I've certainly I remember talking to a number of times, went to visit a small dairy farming community in New Zealand. I used to go over there quite regularly to do other things, and when they had floods they'd invite me to come and talk to their communities. And probably 2 years down the track, one of the farmers said, now that I have understood more about my stress response, I'm realising that nearly everything I did in the first few months was wasted and had to be redone. I didn't stop and think about the long term. And so the adrenaline response focuses on the here and now and on the physical things. That's why it is the survival chemical, why it allows us to do heroic things. And they've done experiments on usually psychology students since the 1950s about adrenaline. Back in the 1950s, they didn't have these damned ethics committees that they had to go through. They just did what made sense. So they'd have a whole lot of these psychology students, and they get them to do a bunch of experiments, and they'd all give them an injection of adrenaline and get them to repeat the experiments. You can't do that nowadays. And what they noticed was that as soon as you give them the adrenaline, they talk about a tunnelling of attention. They focus, like me and the snake. I could tell you exactly what that snake looked like. Its mouth was open and the venom was dripping from its fangs. Well, but you get that vivid imprint because the adrenaline system is actually just using the parts of your mind that are required. But in the case of the bushfire man, the adrenaline was something that actually made him focus on the tangible problem of the loss of the house. And he completely overlooked his family. And probably his wife said, "Oh, it's about time you stayed home." And, "No, and what do you think I'm doing?" And they could generate a little bit of argument, couldn't they? By her trying to sort of draw him back into the family. And he's totally focused on this rebuilding task. And that's because it's tangible and it's physical. And he can work hard, get exhausted and feel he's getting somewhere. Whereas to just hang out with the kids and talk to his wife, there's no tangible product from it. And so when you think about this tunnelling of attention, what do you focus on? Well, you focus on the physical problems that you've got to deal with. That's why it's helpful in the early stage. But I noticed that there's a period around about, I don't know, somewhere between a few months and 6 months. And there's a sort of a change of gear, because up until that time, you're just dealing with one problem after another, whatever the disaster is. But things eventually sort of start to settle and you get into a bit of a routine, or you know, you realise you can't do things for a certain period of time and you've got to get other arrangements and so on. Or you've got to move out of your house. It's an adrenaline thing to move out of your house, find somewhere else to live. And eventually you settle into a bit of a routine in your new place. And then what happens is that you get to a point where you start to feel really low and exhausted. I noticed in the first bushfires that I worked with, that there were very little requests for support from people in the early months. Everyone's too busy to attend to their mental health or their physical health for that matter. And then as you get up to the 6 months, you get this sudden rush of people asking for help in various ways. They're anxious, they're depressed, they're worrying about things, they're starting to get symptoms, maybe they're having accidents and so on. The GPs will say, wow, we've got this rush of people. And that's about the time that the adrenaline response starts to run out. Because what adrenaline does is it uses the reserves of energy you've got tucked away in your body, in your muscles and your liver and so on. You just use these reserves. But reserves are limited and eventually they run out. The analogy I use to talk about that is, you remember the old Volkswagens? There's a few old fellas like me around. Remember those old Volkswagens that had a reserve petrol tank? And I seem to remember there was maybe a lever under the dashboard that you turned. And I remember being in the country one day with somebody in one of these cars, and the car coughed and spluttered, and I looked at the fuel gauge. I said, we run out of petrol. He said, don't worry, I've got a reserve tank. He leans under and he turns this. I seem to remember when, as he turned it, and the car splutters and keeps going. And then he looks at me and says, I've no idea how much is in it. Now, that's a really important point, because if you've just had a really nice holiday in Bali, you're in a great state to have a disaster, aren't you? Right? If you're well and healthy and you've had a lot of sleep and you're full of energy, you're looking for a new interest in life, then the adrenaline's going to get going. But if you've had a long, hard year and you're already very tired, when was it, September, that you had the flood? Pardon? October, yeah. End of a long year. Can you see that your reserve petrol tank's actually 3/4 full or half full or whatever? And so now the thing about adrenaline, why it works so well, is that it shuts down the feedback about how we feel. A strong adrenaline state produces substance called endorphins that lock down pain receptors, so we don't feel pain. You must have had an accident or something when you didn't feel any pain for some time, and then when things settle, the pain kicks in. Or you know, on a football match, you bang yourself and you don't realise until after the match, and your arousal, your adrenaline comes down and you start to feel it. So I notice that is a very general quality that includes things like fatigue. It also will shut down troublesome emotions so that people in that adrenaline state are not really emotional, they're focused on actions. If you try and ask them how they feel, as some misguided journalists do, they'll say, "How do you think I effing well feel?" You know, they get angry by these stupid questions because they're in action mode, they're trying to do something. And so this, I think, is such a generalised tendency that actually is involved in shutting down the whole feedback system to ourselves. Isn't that helpful when you've got a huge amount of work to do? You don't have to worry about feeling tired, you just have to ask what needs to be done. So you can go with less sleep and so on. And so this sets up this tremendous period of overdrive in those early months. And people will often, I remember after Black Saturday, even people who'd had terrible tragedies were running around the place trying to help other people. They'd lost everything they had. And often people are laughing and, you know, there's a whole lot of excitement there. But it's going to hit later. And so this narrowing of attention also involves an externalization of attention, narrowing onto the most obvious physical things and externalizing all the focus. I'm not worrying about myself, I'm focused on there. Now that's a big disruption from normal life when in a routine you actually organize your life, hopefully, so you take good care of yourself. You know, you make sure you go to bed at the right time, get up at the right time, eat what you need, and so on. And if we are leading a healthy life, there's a routine. Now, routines are so important, I've discovered, because if you have a routine, just a simple routine, let's say I go for a walk every morning before breakfast and work. So I had to go into town very early yesterday, and so I missed my walk, and I feel it. So I made sure I did it this morning. You know, a routine will hold you the structure of your life. Well, presumably this guy I talked about, the first man, he presumably had a routine where he occasionally talked to his wife. Maybe they had breakfast together, but that went by the board, didn't it? For however long. And so those routines will provide the framework to maintain the relationships. And if you think about the routines we develop in our life, we actually slowly adjust them and design them to hold the structure of our life. For what purpose? To express the values of what's important in our life. They're designed by values, what's important. And so the structure of our life, the routines of our life, hold the values, such as my marriage is important, or I need to look after my kids, or I need to look after my health, or talk to my neighbours, and so on. And so this 6-month period with the adrenaline going can actually make a mess of this whole life structure that you had hopefully working reasonably well before the disaster came along. So what happens then? People are have dealt with the urgent crisis problems, and then there's a sort of changing of gear where people will actually look at the long and say, "Geez, this is going to take me a long time." I was just talking to a few people on this table saying it'll probably take, 2 or 3 years to get the farm sorted. You know, people will sometimes say it'll take 5 years or 10 years if they've had a lot of physical damage. And some floods, of course, make a mess of the whole place. I remember talking to farmers in one of the little valleys in the Lockyer Valley, and they said it's washed away all of our river flats. They're all gone. So we're going to have to completely change the kind of farming we do. That's going to take them a long time to sort that out and actually get it into a comfortable routine, isn't it? So all of this time, and I was asking my colleagues on that table there, how much additional work are you doing when you're trying to run your farm and you're trying to do the repair work? And we came up with maybe a figure like 20%. But somebody said there's no more hours in the day. So you're constantly juggling. So you're doing 120% work, and you can't do it quickly, you can't resolve it quickly. So you've got to get used to being in a state of, well, I call it frustration. I'd really like to do this, but I can't. Or I'd like to get back into my house, but I can't. Or there are things that are outside of our control. And now, if you keep running at that with adrenaline, then you'll become increasingly frustrated because you can't do what adrenaline wants to do, which is to solve problems. So there's a certain point where if we're going to look after ourselves, we have to change gear from acute stress, which is, I've got a problem, I've got to solve it, there's a snake, to a kind of different organising principle, which is, I've got a huge problem, but there's nothing I can do to solve it today. Right? Now, the part of the brain that operates on adrenaline is, I've got a huge problem and I must do something now or it'll get worse. Right? The snake, the near miss in the car, it's all going to be very simple. I've got to do something now. But the chronic stress scenario is, I've got a big problem, but there's nothing I can do about it this afternoon. So the only way I can deal with this is to actually plod away at it over a long time, probably a few years. You know, the simple example I use about that chronic stress scenario is to have a mortgage. So you've got a big mortgage that's worrying you. There's nothing you can do to solve your mortgage this afternoon, is there? I don't advise you go down to the TAB, although some people will try it. No, you just need to, it's not quite the case in the farming community, but what I say is to people, you have to stay at work until 5 o'clock and go home and come back tomorrow at 9 o'clock and stay until 5 o'clock and do that for about 25 years. That'll help the mortgage, won't it? Can you see that you've got to put yourself in a very different frame of mind to actually solve that long-term problem? So let's not make 25 years, but let's say to get through this disaster, I've got to actually keep focused on what's important over the next few years, whatever it'll take. And what is important? Well, what's important is what you come out with at the other end. Doesn't matter how long it takes, it's what you end up with. See, this man built his house in 6 months, but in 2.5 years, he'd sold it. So he might as well have not built it, mightn't he? And put the energy into his marriage. I asked this man, I said, this is such a really powerful story. Do you mind if I tell this? I didn't tell him I've told it 100 times a year, but no, he said, I'd be really happy if anyone else can benefit from my experience. And it's just such a neat one, but there are many, I could give many different examples of people who make decisions early on. I told this story after Black Saturday when I gave a talk in Yarra Glen. a few days later I went over to Healesville and milling around waiting for the talk, and this great big man came up to me and said, "Are you Rob Gordon?" I said, "Yeah." And he put this great big beefy finger in my chest and said, "I'm going to Queensland tomorrow because of you." And then he laughed and he said, "My wife went to your talk and she said, we're going to take some time off, take a break, because they lost their house, they lost everything. We're going to go to Queensland, have a nice holiday, and then we're going to come back and we're going to sit down and make a plan." Instead of going straight into action, most of which is probably unproductive. And it says, as long as you're in the adrenaline state, okay, it's good to have the professionals here. Thanks. I'm going to have to. So the important thing here is that the focus during the stress period has to hang on to the things you want to come out the other end with. And what are they? I said they're values. It doesn't matter how quick it is for you to rebuild your house. What counts is the life you have in it when you have rebuilt it. Or if you redo your farm, like these farmers in New Zealand who said, we did a whole lot of things working from dawn till dusk, exhausting ourselves in the early months. It all had to be redone. I think they just rebuilt fences that were there, only to realise that the pasture had been ruined and would take a long time to regenerate, and they should have actually put the fences, rearranged their paddocks to make a different set of arrangements. But it was not until they had time to stop and think. And so really getting through the ongoing stress factor is such an important skill. That's where experience comes in. And that's where talking with each other comes in. These farmers said that in New Zealand, the Department of Agriculture sent out advisors. And it was very political at the time. They reckon the advisors had been told by the minister, you must visit every farmer within, 2 weeks. So these advisors would come rushing out, they'd spend 20 minutes talking at them and then go away. Now, when you're in adrenaline mode, you can't actually think clearly. You've got to calm down, you've got to get out of that adrenaline to be able to use your mind. And these guys came and talked their jargon. They didn't actually have much practical experience of floods. They had all the theory, but the farmers couldn't do anything with it. They said what really helped us was when the Farmers Federation organised a whole bunch of farmers from the other side of this was the North Island, from the Manawatu area, who had had a bad flood several years before, to come over and sit down and talk about what they'd learnt. That was practical, that was pre-digested knowledge, and that's what they could use. That was really valuable, he said. Now this says one of the most important things after a disaster is this networking and learning from each other. Learning about simple things, because the flood represents this disruption of the normal arrangements, the normal routine. And once you've lost your normal routine, you have to go into improvising, working things out. And that's where the knowledge that's there in the community, the relationships, who you know, the help you can get, becomes so essential. They've done a huge amount of research now on what the researchers call social capital. Capital is money in the bank, isn't it, which you can draw out and buy a new tractor or fix up the farm. It's something that's there that can be used in different ways. So they say your relationships and who you know and the connections you've got is social capital. It's able to draw on, give you knowledge and assistance and a whole lot of things to help you. In normal life, particularly in rural communities, there's a tremendous amount of social capital, isn't there? Something bad happens to somebody, everyone helps them out. I saw a little snatch of, what's that ABC program where they go around and visit country towns? Back roads. And the local carpenter or he was a tradesman of some sort, he had a fire and burned his shed down and all his tools. And they had a dinner at the local pub, and he didn't realise it was going to happen. And they had a fundraiser at the pub at the dinner, and they got enough money to rebuild his shed and replace his tools. And he was weeping because he was overwhelmed by the generosity of the community. But doesn't it show how much they value him? And so they keep him going, and he can then do whatever his trade is for them, which they'll need. So it's a sort of an example. Now, we don't know that's there under normal circumstance. It's all latent. It's all under the surface. But when something happens, it comes out. It means that the relationships become activated. And now this leads to one of the predictable problems that I've noticed in communities, and that is when the community goes into adrenaline mode, that's when you'll get tremendous generosity and support and assistance and volunteering around the physical problems, because everyone's in adrenaline. Here's the problem, here's the water, we've got to do this, we've got to do fire, we'll all go and put it out. But it means it's focused on the physical problem. And so everyone gets a sense of satisfaction. But once you get that shift into, we've got a big problem we can't solve here. Now, part of the adrenaline response is to focus us on what we think is needed. So any stress response is a response to help us survive difficulties. And if I'm going to survive, it's got to be me, doesn't it? So the stress response, I say, makes us egocentric. It's what I think that's important. It's what I think has to happen. And this makes a tendency that when you see families under stress, it's very easy for people to start bickering and complaining and arguing with each other, because everyone's focused on what they need. And it's very hard to step back. You've got to get out of the stress response, to step back and get to the values and say, hang on, we've got to hold our relationship together. That's more important than whether we do your way or my way. We've got to listen to people and try and understand each other. And so what I've observed is a pattern where you get this early togetherness under high energy and everyone supporting each other. And then as time passes, people's recovery is different. Some people can do it quickly, some people have got this impact, some people have got that impact, and all the personal differences start to come to the fore. But if people are very focused on what they think should happen because they're focused on their problem, it's not going to align, is it? And so what we get is a risk that in this is usually towards the end of the adrenaline phase, you get a period of conflict and disagreements. And they won't be just, I don't really agree with you, I just think it should be, no, it'll be an emotionally charged disagreement because we're all in high energy adrenaline mode and we're also very tired at the same time. And in adrenaline mode, we're very opinionated. So we jumped to conclusions. Have you had that experience after you nearly trod on the snake of jumping sideways at a black crooked stick on the path for the next few weeks? You see, because your brain has latched onto snake and it's opinionated about snakes, so that anything that's vaguely like a snake must be a snake. And then I'm not going to just say, oh, that reminds me of the snake. I'm going to levitate away from it. And this is actually part of the mechanism why we have those triggers when you get the heebie-jeebies from rain after you've had a flood, or you get upset about smoke and it be deep in your brain. I remember going down to Malakuta at early winter, 2 years after the fire, and people were saying when the community members started to light their winter fires, because it was getting cold, and there was smoke drifting around the town, everyone suddenly started to get anxious. What's that? What's burning? What's burning? This is because it goes straight into that action system. And so it's absolutely predictable that there will be a risk of tension, conflict, disagreement, based on people having a very strong but always focused perspective on the situation. And the issues, I can't predict what the issues are going to be. Sometimes there are issues in communities beforehand. They don't always agree with each other, do they? I'm sure a well-run community like yours wouldn't be like that, but in other places, there's history, you know. Those, I call them cleavages, you know, like a diamond is a very strong structure, but the geologists tell us that there's a plane in the crystal structure which is weakened. And if you hit the diamond there, it'll split. That's how you cut a diamond. You cut it according to the cleavage planes. I think communities have cleavage planes, defined by anything that can potentially differentiate the different groups of the community. Now, if we're in high, I'll use a more general word, arousal, high stress arousal state, we're going to latch on to the tangible things at the very time we probably all need to step right back and say, wait a second, let's look at the big picture in the long term. And it's very hard to do that if we're in too much of a stress state. It's very hard to do it for our own lives and prioritise our health and our relationships. I went to a number of meetings in the Coonabarabran area in New South Wales over a number of years. They had a number of very nasty fires. There was a woman there who was one of these people, and I think they're all over the place, who held the whole community in her heart. She wasn't part of the social services or the local government. I think she worked for parks or something like that. But she'd lived there all her life. She knew everybody and she kept tabs on them all. And I went up there one time and she said, I'm really worried about Bill and Mary blogs. They're not doing too well. They had bad fire effects and they've been working themselves into that. They're not getting on very well. They don't talk to each other. See, she knows it all. I really like to get them to come, but I couldn't get them to come. Next time I went up, it was a slightly different community. She said, I've been really working on them. I really think they need to hear your message. And she came up to me before I started and said, they're here. I'm so pleased they're here. And so I gave my talk and I sort of factored in a little bit of what she told me about them. And then the next time I came up, which was probably 18 months later, she said, I must tell you that Bill and Mary, now it's as flat as a pancake out there, it's probably like this. This is what they're doing now. They don't work on Sundays. And they both bought bicycles. And on Sunday morning, they get up and they get on their bicycles and they ride into town which is probably about 15, 20 kilometres. And they go to the nice New Age cafe, like, what's it called? Yeah, Bill and Beats. And they sit there and have avocados and eggs and wholemeal bread and all the good stuff, and lots of coffees, and they sit in the sun and read the paper and talk to the locals. And then they slowly ride their bikes home and take the rest of the afternoon off. And she said, you should see the difference in them. They're smiling, they're talking to each other, etc., etc. You know, this is really very simple. And what it involves is the self-awareness that I'm in stress mode and I'm neglecting all the important things that express the values in my life, like my relationship. And they made a decision to change it. Because if you don't maintain things with energy and attention, they deteriorate, don't they? Tractors, gutters, cars, relationships, blood vessels, right? Digestive systems. And this really touches on during this sort of when we're doing the long grind, which is probably from about, let's say, roughly 6 months to when you're out the other side, that's going to be a couple of years. We're in not in adrenaline mode, there's a different chemistry that doesn't require using up the reserves like adrenaline's, because they're gone. When you're on this other chemical cocktail, I just call it cortisol. That's for the long term. So adrenaline was for escaping from saber-toothed tigers in the last ice age. We really needed it, didn't we? But that wasn't the only problem. We also had famines. Right? Famines is when you have to tighten your belt and just wait till it rains. Eat seeds or something. And that's the cortisol response, is actually putting us into endurance mode as opposed to survival mode. And in this endurance mode, the loss of self-awareness means you don't realise you're in it. And a lot of physical processes don't work right. They get hijacked to keep providing energy. Where does the energy come from? Not from the reserves, but from our own tissues, right? We eat ourselves, if you like. And it's important to understand this because the most common complaint after disasters is a whole list, and in the textbooks there's usually 2 or 3 columns of simple, what I call psychosomatic medical conditions. Psychosomatic. Somatic means to the body, psycho meaning related to stress and tension, digestive problems, sleep difficulties, muscular tensions, headaches, skin problems. Whatever is your vulnerable system in your body is actually going to show up because it's being deprived of energy, because under cortisol you hijack that energy for the constant activity. So the energy, instead of being ploughed back into maintaining your body, is being hijacked. And it's inevitable that it'll start to show up. So, you know, when you're... do you notice that... I notice if I go through a very stressful period, my fingernails will get wrinkled. Well, there's not much left to fall out, but men's hair falls out, doesn't it? It goes grey, and the women talk about the hair splitting and all of these things. All of those physical complaints are signals that the energy's being diverted away from those organs into the simple muscle and brain is all we need. And a lot of the pathways in our body don't work right. I used to work with the case managers after Black Saturday. That's very stressful work. They were dealing with very upset people who had very tragic things happen to them. And I met with a small group of them my last meeting after they'd been working for 2 years, and they said the day before that group had been part of a group of 60 who had their final meeting. And towards the end of the meeting, they talked about how stressful the work had been. And as part of the stress, somebody mentioned, you know, I put on a lot of weight. And everybody, you know, said, oh, so have I. So somebody had the thought of going round. I think there were a couple of hundred people. Was it? No. Sorry, it was about 60 people. And they tallied up the amount of weight the group had put on. It was 200 kilos. So, you know, it's about 8 kilos each, isn't it? Well, probably some people put on 2 and some people put on 10. Now that's quite hard to get off, isn't it? So it's just a picture of how we move into a temporary arrangement of just trying to get energy. And in doing that, we're at risk for changing our lifestyle, which if we maintain for a couple of years, means we may come out the other end of this with a seriously reduced health status, right? Don't you want to eat lots of high-calorie foods when you're feeling tired and exhausted? Lots of Kentucky Fried Chicken because I can't be bothered cooking. Lots of chocolate to get through, you know, and so forth. And so if you go back to that idea of routines that are based on values, routines about diet, exercise, relationships, all of that is liable to be disrupted. And that made me aware that one of the most destructive things that happens in the aftermath of disasters is just the simple fact of the disruption of our life routines and lifestyle. And they become rejigged to meet this false value, I've got to get everything done quickly. What we've got to do is think about, how do I get quality of life in the circumstances I'm in? Quality of life in a house I don't want to live in because I want to get back to my house. Quality of life while I'm waiting for things to be sorted out. And I think the only way we do that is to go back to really communicating with the people we're with. What do we want? What do we value? What's most important? And keep moving from the tangible to the values. What do we want to be like as we come out the other end of this? And now this is not a mental illness. This is not a mental health problem. And this is one of the things I learned already in Ash Wednesday, that it's no good throwing lots of counsellors at everybody. We have to help people stop and understand what's happening to them, because we all go through it. And so this state where people are put on 20 kilos, they're eating the wrong things, they're not sleeping well, you know, they're bickering, life becomes unrewarding. Now, if that goes on for too long, we are at risk for getting depressed, wondering what's the point of it all. And that's where the moment you realise, actually, we're all in the same state, it's not just me, it's a situation, then I can start to depersonalise it. It's not my problem. It's not my wife or my husband's an obnoxious person, I didn't realise how awful they were and I'm wondering what I'm doing here. No, it's the situation. And so then that can be the moment you think, how do we make it better? And so the name I use for this state, I call it degraded quality of life. It's not an illness, it's just the quality of life that gives us the energy. You know, there's part of the energy is physical, but part of the energy comes from enjoyment, doesn't it? Fun, values, and so on. And so I think around about now, whatever length of time it's going to be, I think it becomes very important to start trying to make deliberate decisions about protecting a number of things. First of all, protect relationships in community, because to be part of community gives us an irreplaceable sense of belonging, of value, of having access to help and support. It's not all up to me. I've got lots of people want to help, connecting with council. And there's so much research now that says that those people who get out and go to meetings, and you don't want to when you're in that exhaustion, oh, I can't go to a bloody meeting again. No, just go along and eat the sausages and talk to people. And even if you can't take in all the technical information, just get out there and things will happen. The people that do that, there's been big studies in the US that show they recover faster, they're more productive, and they have less, less symptoms, less health problems. And usually they have that crucial thing of coming out the other end feeling they're wiser. They've learned things. They feel more a part of their community. The risk is, of course, that the community conflict means our community splits. And we've all got to get round what have we got in common, even though we've got big differences of circumstances. So, I think it's not rocket science to look after yourself, but it is important to actually refocus on myself, my family, my community, and then how do we then set about the practical problems. And I think there's just a simple recipe of two basic things: pleasure and leisure. That's what you need to get out of that stress zone. Pleasure and leisure. Pleasure, enjoyment, satisfaction, fulfillment. I was watching something on the internet the other day on YouTube. There was some bloke was talking about dopamine. Dopamine is the feel-good brain chemical. He said you get dopamine hit every time you achieve something. Isn't it nice to finish something off and, I don't know, build a fence or fix a machine or make the bed, dare I say. You've actually done something, you've achieved it. And isn't that very hard to come by in the aftermath of a disaster? Because everything takes so long and everything is involved with everything else. And so really thinking about getting opportunities to get that sense of enjoyment. Some people have told me they started knitting. I've been working with a man. He's a tradesman. He's very much a physical doing things with his hands man, but he had a terrible trauma in his family, and he was really absolutely devastated for a couple of years. And now he's actually on the recovery trajectory, and he's taken up knitting. And he's got a little granddaughter who's the absolute light of his life. And he brought to his session, he brought this sky blue cardigan. She's not even a year old, but this beautiful little sky blue cardigan with lovely little intricate patterns and little embroidered flowers around the buttonholes. And he was so pleased, But this tragedy he had in his family meant there was this terrible pain that he couldn't do anything about. But now he's getting a sense of achievement in his knitting, and it's just a little story. I think it's really important to I think Bill and Mary bought bicycles. They invested some of their money in bicycles, and they probably get, I wonder if they get as fanatical as some cyclists become. But anyway, they've got something to do, and they'll probably have a lot of satisfaction. And leisure. Leisure. What's leisure? Well, I define leisure as when you don't have to do anything. We haven't got time for that. We've got all these things. Don't you realise it's been a flood? No, you can say Sunday is leisure time. And when you put your brain into leisure mode, you will actually allow yourself to use all of the complicated bits of it that we don't normally use when we're in stress mode. We only use the bare minimum. And those complicated bits will be putting things into perspective, looking at the long term, actually working out what's really important, help you get a framework to solve problems, and so on. But do you know what I feel about leisure when I'm very stressed and busy is that it's a waste of time because I'm not producing anything to reduce my stress, like writing a letter to a doctor or a report for a lawyer or something. So, oh God, I can't sit around and do nothing. But that's the false idea, because what will actually happen is if I don't take leisure, I'll have an hour to spare, but my brain won't be capable of writing a report. So I'll file stuff, maybe make a phone call, look out the window, have a cup of coffee, and I won't remember where I put all the stuff I filed because I can't remember, you know, the logic I had. Doesn't that stuff drive you mad? That's a very strong stress symptom, is when you become disorganised. So if we make that recognition that leisure is, when you're in stress mode, wasting time, it's good. You need to waste time regularly. And if when you're wasting time, you actually do something you enjoy, you're going to get energy. I think from enjoyment we get energy that of a sort we can't get any other way. And this holds that really valuable feeling that life is worthwhile. I'm going to end up with this little story. People they live in a harsh stress world for too long. They wonder, what's the point? What am I doing this for? Right? Anyone can get into that point. If it gets too bad, you get into depression, you get into dangerous territory. But anyone will wondering what's the point of it all. One day I was referred this little 10-year-old boy who was really wondering what's the point. He was quite depressed because his family, his father worked for a large multinational company, and whenever they spent any time in an area, he started to make friends, and then they moved and he lost all his friends. And he'd moved once too many times and come to Melbourne, and he was depressed. So he came to see me. And he had a charming little German accent that I can't reproduce. And he was quite an intelligent boy, and he said, I do not see what the point of life is. If you can tell me what the point is, I believe it. But if you can't, I don't see why I should do it. And he was, you know, thinking about dying. So I didn't have an answer, but we worked and talked, and over about 6 months he started to perk up, and his mum was saying he's actually going to school and he's made some friends and so on. And one day he came in and he told me this story where he and a group of his friends on a Saturday afternoon had sort of got in behind a fence on the road, and I forget, they were doing something naughty. I remember doing it myself. They were throwing lemons or something over the fence at people walking past, and they didn't know where it was coming from, and they would be laughing. You remember doing that sort of stuff, or was it just me? Right, and they had a wonderful time, and he was laughing as he was telling me. And I said, Wilhelm, or Wolfgang, I can't remember what his name was, it was a very German name. Tell me, when you were playing and throwing the lemons and you and your friends were laughing, what do you think they thought the meaning of life was? And he thought, he said, they do not ask the question. That's right, because it's obvious what the meaning of life is, isn't it? It's having fun, being together. It's in the doing. And this was the sign that he stopped asking this unanswerable question. And we get into that state when we're too tired, too isolated. And so that's why we need to get out and be part of community and value any relationships we have. Community, family, friends. Put energy and time into being with people, and things will shift, and leisure and pleasure. I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any questions or